Brendan Dassey Trial Transcripts Day 2, continuing on page 184. This is prosecution questioning of William Newhouse, Firearms and Toolmark Examiner. And then in Kansas City from 1988 until I came to Wisconsin in September of 2002. All right, first of all, do you have an undergraduate degree, sir? I do. And what is your degree in? I have a Bachelor of Science degree in physics. From what university? From Purdue University. Did you pursue graduate courses beyond that? I took some graduate courses after I received my Bachelor of Science degree. Some of those were in physics. All right. And in terms of your experience as a firearms and tool examiner, where did you begin your career? I accepted a position with the California Department of Justice in the Sacramento Laboratory in August of 1972. Didn't really get acquainted with firearms and tool marks immediately. I was trained in a couple of other areas of the laboratory until about 19. I think the fall of 1973 when I took a course taught by one of the examiners there in the laboratory that dealt with kind of the history of firearms and tool mark identification and how it related to criminal justice. And then in the fall of 1974, I went through the training program that they had in place in the Sacramento Laboratory at that time for firearms and toolmark examiners. It was a 2.5 or 3-month program, as I recall. I completed that successfully, and in January of 1975 was asked to take a course that dealt with the theory of identification. How is it we can look at a bullet or a cartridge casing or any kind of tool mark and really answer questions about what tool or what weapon caused the markings that we observed on those items. Completed that course successfully. I think the next week I was over in San Mateo Crime Laboratory on another 3-day course that dealt with ammunition problems and automatic weapons. And then having completed that series of courses in May of 1975, I was assigned to the Firearms and Toolmark section of the Sacramento Laboratory. And until I left there, I was responsible for most of the firearms and toolmark casework that left that laboratory. There were other examiners that could do that kind of work and did. I worked in there full-time until I left there and went to the Montana State Crime Laboratory in, I think it was January 1981. All right, in terms of your California experience, in particular the Sacramento lab, how many other examiners did you work with in that lab? There were probably, any time there, 3 or 4 other examiners. They're called criminalists in California, who were trained and capable of doing firearms cases. Most of them did not do those full time. They did them as they encountered them in their work in other kinds of disciplines in the laboratory. But I was for that period, the single examiner who worked full time in the firearms and toolmark section. All right, and after you left California, what was your next experience? I went to the Montana State Crime Laboratory. That was in January of 1981 and became that state's firearms and toolmark examiner. All right, and then you mentioned something about Kansas City, Missouri. Tell us about that. In November of is that right? November, I think, of 1988, I accepted a position in the Kansas City Police Department Crime Laboratory in Kansas City, Missouri, as one of 4 firearms examiners in that laboratory. And I believe you indicated you came to Wisconsin in September 2000? I think it was 2002. All right, yes. And you are based in the Madison office? Yes. All right. And do you have any estimate for us as to approximately how many times you've been asked to come to a court of law and render expert opinion regarding firearms identification? I know it's been more than 300 times in the course of the 30-some years that I've been doing the work. All right. Are you a member of any professional associations or affiliations that you find useful and practical in the field of firearms identification? Yes, I am. Tell us about those, please. I am a member of the Association of Firearms and Toolmark Examiners. It is the single professional organization, international organization, for a firearms and toolmark examiner that is focused specifically on that area of forensics. All right, from time to time you have taken any courses to maintain currency in the literature and in the sciences of firearms identification? There are a couple things that we can do in terms of formal courses. While I was in Montana, I had the opportunity to go to the FBI Academy. I took and completed a week-long course there that dealt with specialized techniques in firearms identification. Beyond that, attending the AFTE, or the Association of Firearms and Toolmark Examiners meetings. Those are training seminars. A lot of it, of course, most of it is papers and research being presented to those of us who attend, and I've gotten to do that off and on over the years as well. All right, very well. Let's begin then. First of all, tell us what firearms identification is or involves. Well, as I said, I'm examining evidence that's been recovered in investigations or crimes that involve the shooting of a firearm. Clearly, I'm going to be involved with firearms, be examining firearms. I'm test firing them in the laboratory, determining whether they function or don't function or whether they've been altered. Additionally, we recover bullets and cartridge casings from scenes, from autopsies, and there is always the question, when we have a gun recovered, of whether that bullet or the cartridge casing, if it's recovered, have been fired from the particular gun that was recovered. In those cases where we might not have a gun recovered, I answer other questions. Was there only one gun involved in this shooting? Was there more than one gun involved in this shooting? Those questions are all answered by examinations of the bullets and cartridge casings, and where possible, the test firing of the weapon in the laboratory. Finally, the other area of firearms and tool marks that I'm involved in is involved with gunpowder residues, answering questions about distances, where I can between a victim and the muzzle of the weapon when it was fired. All right, well, let's begin. I think by defining some terms, for many of us who may not be all that familiar with firearms. First of all, tell us, what is a cartridge? If you're going to fire a gun, you have to load the cartridge into the weapon, and the cartridge is designed for the particular weapon in which it's going to be fired. Usually a cartridge consists of, say, 4 components. One of them is going to be the projectile or the bullet. Sometimes it's called a slug. One component will be the cartridge casing in which the bullet is mounted. Another component is the gunpowder. When the cartridge fires, it's the gunpowder inside the cartridge that explodes, and that's what forces the bullet out of the barrel of the weapon, and of course down range and in the direction that the weapon is pointed. The last component, the most modern ammunition, is going to be something called a primer, and this is just another compound not dissimilar to gunpowder, but chemically different. That is very shock sensitive, and that when struck by a part of the gun designed to strike the cartridge will cause the primer to explode, set the gunpowder on fire, essentially cause that to explode, and then we have a gun firing. All right, how is a cartridge then fired from a weapon? Well, you're going to have to load the cartridge in one manner or another into a particular part of the weapon. You're going to have to cock the weapon or aim it, and this is all defined by how that weapon is designed. And then to actually fire the cartridge, assuming the gun's working properly, you have to generally pull the trigger. And pulling that trigger causes a part of the gun to strike the cartridge and causes the cartridge then to explode and the bullet to be fired. All right, where does the firing pin, or how does that figure into the actual firing of the cartridge? Well, that part of the gun that actually strikes the cartridge and causes it to fire is what we call a firing pin. In certain weapons, it might be called a striker. Essentially, what it is a piece of metal that when the trigger is pulled is released and allowed to strike the cartridge. What happens to the cartridge, or perhaps a better way of asking it is, what happens to the bullet which is mounted in the casing or the cartridge once the weapon is fired? Well, the bullet, which initially is mounted in the cartridge, is propelled by the gases created by the explosion of the gunpowder, is propelled down the barrel of the weapon, and of course, whatever direction the gun's pointed at is the direction that the bullet is going to be projected. All right, generally what happens to the cartridge itself once the bullet is expelled? Once you've fired your cartridge, you now have, and the bullet's on its way, you have left in the gun the cartridge casing. What happens to the cartridge casing after you fired the gun is determined by how the weapon is designed. In a semi-automatic weapon, whether a handgun or a rifle or a shotgun, that cartridge casing is going to be extracted and ejected from the weapon, out of the weapon and onto the ground. If it's a revolver or certain other kinds of handguns, the cartridge casing may remain in the weapon, and then you may have to actually extract it from the weapon manually. Now, there's some other terms and phrases that I think are bandied about quite a bit in mainstream media and television, and these are terms called lands and grooves. Do you recognize those terms? And if so, tell us what they are. Yeah, if you look down the barrel of any modern weapon, with the exception of a shotgun, what you'll notice is that there are grooves in the barrel. And we're talking about the inside of the barrel, and the barrel of the weapon is just a tube, and inside that barrel, in the manufacture of the barrel, they've put these grooves in there. You probably also noticed that they are twisted as you look down there. We call those grooves, of course, grooves. We call the areas between the grooves in the barrel lands. That's L-A-N-D-S. I'm not sure where the term ever came from and never heard a really good story for it. When I'm looking at bullets, what I see are land and groove impressions, but they're created by contact between the bullet and the inside of the barrel of that weapon. Given that how a cartridge is filed, or excuse me, how a cartridge is fired in a weapon, and these lands and grooves, what is it that makes the actual identification, for instance, of a bullet as having been fired by a particular gun possible? Well, what makes it possible ultimately is the manufacturing process used to create the barrel of the gun, in the case of a bullet or other parts of the weapon that come into contact with the cartridge casing. If I'm asked to determine whether a bullet was fired from a particular gun, the way I'm going to do that eventually is by putting a test-fired bullet, one I fired in the laboratory from that gun and one that I know has been marked only by the barrel of that gun. I'm going to put that bullet under the microscope. I'm going to examine those test-fired bullets, and what I'm going to look for are patterns of scratches, or what we call in the field are stria. These are engravings on the side of the bullet that are created by microscopic defects inside the barrel of the weapon. When the bullet passes through that barrel, it's coming into contact with those defects, and they're leaving patterns of scratches or stria on the surface of the bullet. I have to be able to determine or conclude that, in fact, all the test-fired bullets that I'm seeing from the gun are creating the same pattern of markings. Having done that, I then know what to look for on the bullet that's been recovered in a crime, and maybe a bullet that's been recovered in an autopsy, or may have been taken out of a tree in a shooting. But I'm going to look at that bullet. I'm going to look for those same patterns of stria on the surface of that bullet, and if I see those patterns, if I can be assured with my examination, the patterns I do see are the kind of thing I expect to see on any bullet fired from that specific gun, then I can conclude that the bullet that was recovered in the shooting was fired from that particular gun. Until I see these patterns and I see them reproducing, I can't come to any conclusion at all about that. Very well, let's talk about your findings in this case. First, I'm going to have Investigator Wiegert show you, I believe, what is marked for or had been received into evidence as exhibit number 128, and ask if you, first of all, can examine that item and tell us if you recognize it. Yes, I do. And what is exhibit 128? Well, exhibit 128 is a paper bag, now opened, that contained a box. All of these are marked in some way or another so that I could recognize them later. Within the box are, I believe, 11 fired cartridge casings that were submitted in the course of this investigation. All right, now we're showing a projection now of that item. Is that what you're examining? I believe it's exhibit 120 is being depicted on the screen. Yes, it is. At this point, when I concluded my examinations, I put the cartridge casings in small plastic bags. When that photograph was taken, they obviously were not in those plastic bags. All right, and as part of your first examination in this case, were you also asked to examine a .22 caliber rifle? Yes, I was. All right, I'm going to have Investigator Wiegert show you exhibit 129. Do you recognize exhibit 129? I do. What is 129? Exhibit 129 is a .22 caliber rifle. It's manufactured by Marlin Firearms Company. The model of rifle is a Glenfield Model 60. This happens to be a semi-automatic rifle. I can recognize it because of the sticker I placed on it, that with the appropriate information and by the serial number on the weapon. All right, and just so that we're clear, what kind of examination did you do? Reference that rifle and the cartridges which are contained in Exhibit 128? Well, the first thing that I did with Exhibit 129, because I knew I was going to test fire the weapon, was to give it an examination, checking the function of the weapon, checking the condition of the gun, documenting and writing down information about the weapon, the serial number, manufacturer, and so on. And I wanted to make sure that the gun was working, first of all, and secondly, I wanted to make sure that it was safe to fire the weapon, because I knew this was something I wanted to do, and because I'm going to want bullets and cartridge casings that I know have been fired in this gun. So having completed that series of examinations, the next thing I did was to obtain those test fires to determine what ammunition to fire in the weapon, fire it in the laboratory, and then recover the cartridge casings and bullets. All right, tell us about the procedure you then employed for test firing. What did you do? What was the first step?